We close our eyes now and let our minds drift back in time. We are floating above the ancient city of Rome, a city of 7 hills, of sprawling aqueducts that snake across the landscape, and of grand marble forums bustling with life. The year is 44 BCE, a pivotal moment in history, a point of no return for a man who shaped the destiny of an empire, and, in turn, the course of Western civilization. This man is Gaius Julius Caesar, a name that echoes through the ages, a figure of immense ambition and unparalleled charisma. But tonight, we do not focus solely on his triumphs. Instead, we delve into the heart of a profound human drama, a tale of friendship and betrayal, of ambition and fear, and of the tragic end of a titan at the hands of those he considered friends. Our journey begins long before the fateful Ides of March. To understand the betrayal, we must first understand the man who was betrayed. Caesar was a military genius, a politician of extraordinary skill, and a populist who connected with the common people of Rome in a way few others ever had. He conquered Gaul, expanding the Roman Republic's territory to the Atlantic Ocean. He crossed the Rubicon, a daring act of defiance against the Senate that ignited a civil war. He emerged victorious, seizing control of the Republic and transforming it from a fragile democracy into an autocracy in all but name. He was declared dictator for life, a title that, to many Romans, sounded uncomfortably like a king. And in the Roman Republic, kings were the stuff of nightmares, a tyrannical past they had sworn to leave behind centuries ago. At the heart of this unfolding tragedy is another figure, Marcus Junius Brutus. We know him best as the friend and protege who ultimately plunged a dagger into Caesar's side. Yet, the relationship between these two men is far more complex than a simple story of a trusted friend's betrayal. Brutus was a man of principle, a descendant of Lucius Junius Brutus, the legendary founder of the Roman Republic, who had expelled the last king, Tarquin the Proud. This heritage weighed heavily on Marcus Brutus. He saw himself as a guardian of the Republic's ancient liberties, a man bound by a sacred duty to prevent any one man from seizing absolute power. As Caesar's power grew, the Senate, the ancient governing body of Rome, found itself increasingly sidelined. The Senate was composed of Rome's most influential families, the patricians, who had for generations ruled the Republic. They watched with mounting horror as Caesar consolidated power, passed laws without their approval, and accepted honors that hinted at a permanent monarchical rule. They feared not just for their political influence, but for the very soul of the Republic. The fear was palpable, a cold dread that Rome was sliding back into the tyranny it had fought so hard to escape. This fear, this deep-seated anxiety about the Republic's future, becomes the fertile ground for conspiracy. The conspirators, a diverse group of senators and aristocrats, were united by their shared concern for liberty and their disdain for Caesar's perceived arrogance. They saw him as a threat to their way of life, a man whose ambition knew no bounds. And so they began to meet in secret, their whispers weaving a web of intrigue and plot. The goal was simple, yet audacious, to remove the dictator and restore the Republic. But in their minds, this was not murder. It was a sacrifice for the greater good of Rome. The story we are about to hear unfolds in a world of stark contrasts, the public spectacle of political life in the Forum versus the quiet, clandestine meetings of the conspirators. The glorious triumphs of Caesar versus the quiet anxieties of the Roman elite. The fierce loyalty of Caesar's soldiers versus the cold, calculated principles of men like Brutus. We will walk through the streets of Rome, listen to the hushed conversations in the villas of the wealthy, and feel the tension building with each passing day. This is a story of human weakness and strength, of political ideology clashing with personal relationships, and of a fateful decision that would change everything. As we settle in, let us not rush to judgment, but instead listen with an open mind to this ancient, timeless tale of betrayal. The Roman Republic in the mid-1st century BCE was a political entity teetering on the edge of a precipice. For centuries, its governance had been a delicate, often tumultuous balance of power between the Senate, the aristocratic body that held traditional authority, and the popular assemblies, which represented the will of the Roman people. This system was not a true democracy as we understand it today, but a complex oligarchy where the most powerful families, the patricians, vied for influence. When Julius Caesar returned to Rome in 45 BCE, triumphant from his civil war victories, he shattered this balance irrevocably. His conquest of Gaul had not only made him immensely wealthy and popular with the legions, but it had also given him an unassailable political platform. He had crossed the Rubicon with his army, a direct act of war against the Senate and the Republic, and had emerged the undisputed master of the Roman world. The Senate, the very heart of Rome's traditional power structure, found itself in an unprecedented and deeply uncomfortable position. Caesar, now declared dictator perpetuo or dictator for life, held all the reins of power. He controlled the armies, the treasury, and the legislative process. The once mighty senators, who had spent their lives debating and maneuvering for influence, were now little more than a rubber stamp for Caesar's decrees. This was a direct affront to their historical identity and their political relevance. They saw their cherished republic, the legacy of their ancestors, being dismantled before their very eyes. They weren't just losing power, they were losing their purpose. The fear was not only about their personal status, but about the very essence of what it meant to be Roman. The term tyrant began to be whispered in the hushed corners of senatorial villas. For the Roman elite, a tyrant was a figure from a dark, forgotten past, a king who ruled by force, not by law. The Roman Republic was founded on the principle of expelling kings and preventing any one man from holding absolute power. The historical precedent was etched in their collective memory, a cautionary tale of a brutal monarchy they had sworn to never repeat. Caesar's accumulation of titles, his reforms, and his almost regal bearing were all seen as steps toward the very tyranny their forebears had overthrown. The fear was not entirely irrational. Caesar was, in many ways, a king without a crown. He sat in a golden chair in the Senate. He wore a purple toga, colors and symbols associated with Roman monarchs, and he accepted honors that seemed to border on the divine. The Senate's fear of a return to monarchy was genuine and deeply rooted in their historical identity. Compounding this fear was Caesar's populist appeal. While the Senate saw him as a threat, the common people of Rome, the plebeians, saw him as a hero. He had enacted land reforms, distributed grain, and sponsored magnificent public games and building projects that created jobs and beautified the city. To the average Roman, Caesar was a benefactor, a man who cared for their welfare in a way the aloof, squabbling Senate never had. This created a dangerous divide. The Senate felt isolated, their political traditions and principles now seen as old-fashioned and out of touch by a populace that adored their new master. The more Caesar was loved by the masses, the more the Senate feared and resented him. They saw his popularity as a tool for his own power, a means to bypass their authority entirely. The political climate in Rome became incredibly tense. The air was thick with mistrust and conspiracy. Every decree from Caesar's hand, every honor bestowed upon him, every public appearance he made was scrutinized by the Senate for signs of monarchical ambition. They saw his reforms not as acts of benevolence, but as calculated moves to secure his position. The Senate's fear was not just of Caesar as a man, but of the precedent he was setting. They worried that once the Republic was gone, it could never be restored. The betrayal that was to come was not born of simple hatred or a sudden burst of anger. It was the culmination of years of growing unease, of a fundamental ideological clash between one man's vision for a strong, centralized Rome and the Senate's deep-seated commitment to the ancient, fragile liberties of the Republic. It was a betrayal born of fear, a desperate act to stop what they saw as an inevitable slide into tyranny. Amidst the simmering tension and the Senate's growing fear, one man, Marcus Junius Brutus, stood at a critical crossroads. His relationship with Julius Caesar was complex, a tapestry woven with threads of personal affection, political debt, and deep-seated ideological conflict. To understand Brutus's ultimate decision, we must delve into the duality of his life. On one hand, he was a member of the old Roman aristocracy, a man whose lineage was a constant reminder of the Republic's founding principles. He was a direct descendant of Lucius Junius Brutus, the legendary figure who, according to tradition, had led the revolt against the last king of Rome, Tarquin the Proud, and established the Republic. This heritage was not merely a matter of pride for Marcus Brutus. It was a heavy burden of expectation and duty. He was expected to be a guardian of liberty, a bulwark against tyranny, just as his ancestor had been. On the other hand, Brutus owed a great deal to Caesar. During the civil war between Caesar and Pompey the Great, Brutus had initially sided with Pompey. After the decisive Battle of Pharsalus, where Caesar's forces emerged victorious, Brutus was pardoned. This was not a simple act of political expediency. Caesar had a genuine affection for Brutus. He saw in the younger man not just a political opponent, but a brilliant mind and a potential protege. Caesar showered Brutus with honors and positions, appointing him governor of Cisalpine Gaul and, most significantly, naming him Praetor Urbanus, one of the most prestigious judicial offices in Rome. These were not small gifts. They were a clear sign of Caesar's high regard and his hope for a political alliance with a man of such a distinguished name and intellect. This created a profound internal conflict for Brutus. He was torn between his loyalty to Caesar, a man who had shown him immense kindness and trust, and his inherited duty to the Republic, a political ideal he held sacred. He was a man of thought and philosophy, a follower of Stoicism, which emphasized duty, virtue, and reason above personal emotions. The Stoic ideal of libertas, or liberty, was not just political freedom, but a state of moral and intellectual autonomy. For Brutus, Caesar's growing power represented a direct threat to this ideal. The Republic was not a perfect system, but it was a system of laws, not of men. Caesar's rule, no matter how benevolent, was a rule by a single man, which, in Brutus's eyes, was the very definition of tyranny. As the months passed, the whispers of conspiracy grew louder, and the pressure on Brutus intensified. He was increasingly seen as the moral compass of the senatorial opposition. The other conspirators, men like Gaius Cassius Longinus, a fierce opponent of Caesar, saw Brutus as a necessary figurehead. They knew that a plot against Caesar would be seen as a mere power grab unless it was led by a man of unimpeachable character and republican lineage. Cassius, Brutus's brother-in-law, played a crucial role in pushing him toward the conspiracy. He famously wrote notes and left them on Brutus's praetor's seat with messages like, "You sleep, Brutus," and "You are not a true Brutus." These taunts were a deliberate and calculated effort to appeal to Brutus's sense of duty and his family legacy. The final straw for Brutus was not a single event, but a culmination of Caesar's actions. The ultimate insult to the Republic came during the festival of the Lupercalia, just a month before the assassination. During the celebrations, Marc Antony, Caesar's most loyal lieutenant, publicly offered him a diadem, a symbol of royalty, and placed it on his head. Caesar, in a shrewd political move, rejected it, but the damage was done. The public spectacle confirmed the senator's worst fears. Caesar was not just an ambitious politician, he was a potential king. For Brutus, this act, witnessed by all of Rome, was a desecration of the Republic and an open challenge to everything his family name stood for. His internal struggle was over. His duty to his ancestors and to the Republic had to take precedence over his personal feelings for Caesar. He would not just join the conspiracy, he would become its moral heart. He believed, in his profound and tragic conviction, that he was not committing a murder, but a necessary sacrifice for the preservation of Roman liberty. The conspiracy against Julius Caesar did not spring into existence overnight. It began with whispers, then grew into clandestine meetings in the dim light of Roman villas, far from the public eye of the Forum. The initial gatherings were small, a collection of senators and aristocrats united by a shared fear and a growing sense of desperation. The driving force behind the plot was Gaius Cassius Longinus, a man of fierce temperament and a passionate, almost fanatical, hatred for Caesar. Cassius had been a prominent supporter of Pompey the Great during the Civil War and had been pardoned by Caesar, but unlike Brutus, he never accepted the dictator's clemency as an act of grace. He saw it as a humiliation, a reminder of his defeat, and his bitterness fueled his desire for revenge. He was the cold, pragmatic mind of the conspiracy, organizing the details and recruiting new members. However, Cassius knew that his personal animosity would not be enough to legitimize the plot in the eyes of the Roman people or the other senators. The conspiracy needed a moral leader, a figure whose reputation was unassailable and whose motives were beyond reproach. This is where Marcus Junius Brutus became essential. Cassius, his brother-in-law, tirelessly worked to persuade Brutus that his duty to the Republic outweighed his personal affection for Caesar. He appealed to Brutus's famous lineage, reminding him of his ancestor, the founder of the Republic. The presence of Brutus transformed the plot from a personal vendetta into a defense of Roman liberty, a noble and necessary act. With Brutus's consent, the conspiracy gained credibility and a sense of moral purpose that drew other, more cautious senators into its orbit. The conspirators were a diverse group, each with their own reasons for joining. Some were Pompeian veterans like Cassius, who nursed a deep-seated grudge. Others were senators who felt their power and dignity had been stripped away by Caesar's reforms and his unilateral rule. There were also those who feared for their own lives, seeing Caesar's dictatorship as a dangerous precedent that could one day turn on them. The names of the conspirators form a list of some of the most influential men in Rome. There was Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, a trusted friend and an old companion of Caesar from the Gallic Wars. Decimus's presence was particularly significant, as he was so close to Caesar that he could act as a direct intermediary and ensure Caesar's presence at the fateful Senate meeting. Another key conspirator was Gaius Trebonius, who had served under Pompey and later joined Caesar's side, only to grow disillusioned with the dictator's power. Trebonius, along with Tullius Cimber, was instrumental in planning the attack itself. Cimber's brother had been exiled by Caesar, and he sought revenge, his personal grievance aligning with the broader political motives. The conspirators, initially a small, secretive group, grew to an estimated 60 to 80 men. Their meetings were held in private homes and quiet corners of the city, away from the prying eyes of Caesar's spies and supporters. The discussions were intense, focused on not only the act itself, but also the aftermath. They debated whether to kill Marc Antony as well, a move Cassius strongly advocated for, but Brutus, ever the idealist, rejected. Brutus believed that their goal was to restore the Republic, not to start a new cycle of bloodshed. He wanted the killing to be a sacrifice, not a massacre. The logistical challenges were immense. They needed to find a time and place where Caesar would be isolated and unarmed, and they needed to act with swiftness and precision. The Senate meeting on the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BCE, at the theater of Pompey, provided the perfect opportunity. Caesar, trusting and confident in his popularity, planned to attend without a large bodyguard. The conspirators decided that this public setting, in the very building built by Caesar's old rival, was the most symbolic and effective place to carry out their deed. They were not just planning an assassination, they were staging a dramatic public declaration of their intent to restore the Republic. The stage was set for one of the most famous betrayals in history. The days leading up to the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BCE, were filled with an atmosphere of foreboding and unease, as if the very air of Rome was heavy with a sense of impending doom. For the conspirators, the tension was almost unbearable. Every shadow seemed to hide a spy, every hurried glance a sign of discovery. For Caesar, however, the mood was one of almost serene confidence, a stark contrast that would prove to be his undoing. He had dismissed his personal bodyguard, a cohort of Spanish soldiers, believing he had nothing to fear from the Roman people he had so generously served. He famously declared that it was better to die once than to live in constant fear. Yet, the universe seemed to conspire against him, sending a series of warnings that, in his hubris, he chose to ignore. The signs and portents began subtly. According to ancient sources, a soothsayer named Spurina had warned Caesar to beware the Ides of March. The warning was delivered publicly, a prophecy that became so famous it has been immortalized in literature. Caesar, ever the pragmatist, is said to have brushed it off, joking as he walked to the Senate on the fateful day, "The Ides of March are come." To which the soothsayer grimly replied, "Aye, Caesar, but not gone." This exchange, perhaps apocryphal, perfectly captures the clashing mindsets of the time, the superstitious dread of the public and the rationalist arrogance of the dictator. The night before the assassination, Caesar's wife, Calpurnia, was plagued by a terrifying nightmare. She dreamt that the roof of their house collapsed and that Caesar was stabbed to death in her arms. She awoke in a state of panic, begging Caesar not to go to the Senate that day. She was not alone in her fears. A number of omens had been observed. Reports of strange birds flying into the forum, the screeching of owls in the daytime, and the unsettling behavior of the sacrificial animals during auguries, all pointed to some terrible fate awaiting the city. Even the omens of the gods seemed to be against him. When Caesar's priest sacrificed a bull, the heart was missing from its carcass, an event considered to be one of the most dire portents in Roman religion. Caesar, however, remained resolute. He was a man who believed in his own destiny and his ability to master any challenge. He initially listened to Calpurnia's pleas and decided to stay home. He sent his faithful lieutenant, Marc Antony, to dismiss the Senate for the day, but the conspirators were not to be so easily thwarted. They had staked everything on this day, and the news of Caesar's absence sent a jolt of panic through their ranks. Their plan was unraveling. At this critical moment, one of the key conspirators, Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, a man Caesar trusted implicitly, was dispatched to Caesar's house. Decimus, a skilled orator and a cunning diplomat, played on Caesar's pride and his sense of duty. He argued that Caesar's absence would make him look weak and cowardly. He convinced Caesar that the senators were waiting to give him new honors and that he should not disappoint them. Lulled by Decimus's persuasive arguments and perhaps swayed by his own confidence, Caesar changed his mind. He bid farewell to a tearful Calpurnia and set off for the Senate, his mind made up. As he made his way through the streets of Rome, another warning came in the form of a man named Artemidorus, a Greek teacher of rhetoric. Artemidorus had learned of the plot and had written down a detailed account of the conspiracy on a scroll. He pushed his way through the crowd, trying to hand the note directly to Caesar, but the dictator, ever popular and surrounded by a throng of well-wishers, did not have a chance to read it. He simply tucked the scroll into his toga, intending to read it later. The final, ignored warning was a tragic symbol of Caesar's confidence and the fatal flaws in his character that would lead to his demise. The stage was now set, and the dictator was walking directly into the trap that had been so meticulously laid for him. The Senate meeting on the Ides of March was not held in the traditional Senate House, or Curia, which was undergoing renovations. Instead, it was convened in the Curia Pompeiana, a large hall attached to the Theater of Pompey. This location was heavy with symbolism. It was a space built and funded by Pompey the Great, Caesar's former ally and later his most bitter rival, whose statue still stood prominently at one end of the hall. It was here, in the shadow of his defeated adversary, that Caesar would meet his fate. As Caesar entered the hall, he was met by a group of senators, including the conspirators, who rose to greet him as a sign of respect. The atmosphere seemed, on the surface, to be one of normal senatorial business. But beneath the veneer of civility, a coil of tension was tightening with every passing moment. The conspirators had carefully planned their roles. The first to approach Caesar was Tullius Cimber, who had been tasked with a seemingly innocuous plea. He wanted Caesar to recall his exiled brother. This act was the signal. As Cimber knelt before Caesar, tugging at his toga and appealing to him, the other conspirators slowly gathered around. Caesar, growing impatient with Cimber's insistent pleas, pushed him away. It was at this moment that Cimber, in a final dramatic gesture, pulled down Caesar's toga from his shoulders, exposing his chest. This was the signal for the attack to begin. Servilius Casca, one of the conspirators, was the first to strike. He aimed a hesitant blow at Caesar's neck, a stroke that was clumsy and only grazed him. Caesar, reacting with surprise and anger, cried out in Latin, "Casca, you villain, what are you doing?" and grappled with the conspirator, seizing his arm. The hall erupted into chaos. The other senators, both those in on the plot and those who were not, were stunned and panicked. Some fled the building, while others stood frozen in fear. The conspirators, now emboldened, surged forward. Daggers, concealed within their togas, flashed in the light. They attacked Caesar from all sides, a frenzy of blades and bodies. The attack was not a single, decisive blow, but a chaotic, brutal assault. The plan was not for one man to be the executioner, but for every conspirator to play a part, so that the responsibility for the act was shared by all. This was meant to signify that the killing was not a personal murder, but a collective sacrifice for the Republic. Caesar, a seasoned warrior who had survived countless battles, initially fought back. He was a strong man, and in the confined space, he struggled against his attackers. He was still trying to fend them off when he saw a familiar face among them, the face of Marcus Junius Brutus. The sight of his friend and protege, dagger in hand, among his assassins was the final devastating blow. According to the ancient historian Suetonius, Caesar's last words were not the famous "Et tu, Brute?" and "You, Brutus?" but rather the Greek phrase "Kai su teknon," "You too, child?" Whether he spoke in Latin or Greek, the meaning was the same, a final, heartbroken recognition of the ultimate betrayal. He ceased his struggle, pulled his toga over his face, and allowed the conspirators to finish their bloody work. The assassination was a frenzied, brutal act. He was stabbed 23 times. He fell at the foot of Pompey's statue, his blood staining the marble floor. In a final, morbidly symbolic moment, the founder of the Roman Republic, Lucius Junius Brutus, had been avenged by his descendant. The conspirators, their daggers dripping with blood, stood over his body, triumphant. They had done it. They had removed the tyrant. Brutus, his dagger still red, attempted to address the now empty hall, to proclaim their deed as a liberation. But there were few to hear him. The assassination was over, but the consequences of their actions were just beginning. The silence that followed the frenzied attack was deafening, a quiet that portended a storm of unimaginable fury. The immediate aftermath of the assassination was not the celebration of liberty the conspirators had envisioned. Instead, a deep and terrifying silence fell over the Curia Pompeiana. The conspirators, standing over Caesar's body, their daggers still in their hands, were initially frozen in a mixture of triumph and shock. Marcus Junius Brutus, attempting to seize the moment, held aloft his bloodied dagger and delivered a rousing speech to his fellow conspirators and the few senators who had remained, proclaiming that the Republic was now free. He then led the group, their faces grim but resolute, out into the Forum, expecting to be met by a cheering crowd of grateful Romans. What they found was not a celebration, but a city paralyzed by fear and confusion. The news spread like wildfire, carried by the fleeing senators and panicked citizens. Rome, a city of 1 million people, ground to a halt. The streets emptied, shops were shuttered. The initial reaction of the Roman populace was not one of gratitude for their newfound freedom, but one of terror. They did not know who was next. Would this be the beginning of a bloody purge? Would another civil war erupt? The conspirators, marching through the streets, found themselves alone, their heroic act not understood by a public that had largely loved and supported Caesar. The conspirators, finding the city silent and hostile, made their way to the Capitoline Hill, a fortified position that was home to the city's most important temples. They barricaded themselves there, a symbolic move to declare their deed as a holy act for the good of Rome, but also a practical one to protect themselves from any potential backlash. They were in a state of limbo, trapped between their ideals and the unexpected reality of the public's reaction. Meanwhile, at Caesar's home, his loyal lieutenant, Marc Antony, was dealing with the sudden vacuum of power. Antony, a charismatic and ambitious man, was a key figure in this unfolding drama. Initially, he had feared for his own life and had gone into hiding. But as the day progressed and he realized the conspirators had no plan for the aftermath and no public support, he began to see a path forward for himself. He secured Caesar's will and his private papers from Calpurnia. This was a critical move, as the will would prove to be a powerful tool in shaping public opinion. The Senate, now reconvened and under the influence of the remaining political leaders, was in a state of high anxiety. They had to decide how to proceed. Should they declare the conspirators heroes and Caesar a tyrant? Or should they declare the conspirators murderers and risk another war? In a brilliant stroke of political maneuvering, Marc Antony suggested a compromise. He proposed that Caesar's acts be ratified and his assassins be granted amnesty. This seemed to be a perfect solution. It appeased the remaining Caesarians by upholding Caesar's legacy while also protecting the conspirators. The Senate, desperate for a way out of the crisis, agreed. They thought they had averted a disaster, but in reality, they had simply postponed it. The climax of this period of chaos was the day of Caesar's public funeral. This was not a private affair. It was a grand, theatrical event in the Forum, attended by thousands of Roman citizens. A magnificent gilded bier was placed in the Forum, and a wax effigy of Caesar was displayed, showing all 23 stab wounds. This visual, a silent accusation against his killers, was a masterstroke of emotional manipulation. Marc Antony, who had secured the right to deliver the funeral oration, was ready. He stood before the massive crowd, a crowd that had just heard the Senate declare Caesar's killers to be patriots. Antony's task was simple yet monumental: to turn the public's confusion and fear into rage and vengeance. He began his speech, and the world held its breath. The atmosphere in the Roman Forum on the day of Julius Caesar's funeral was electric. It was a sea of faces, a mix of genuine mourners, the curious, and the politically astute, all gathered to witness the final rites for a man who had dominated their lives for years. The body of Caesar lay on a magnificent bier, but it was not the body itself that captivated the crowd. A wax effigy had been placed atop it, a gruesome and realistic rendering of the dictator, showing all 23 of the wounds he had sustained. This silent visual was more powerful than any speech, a constant, visceral reminder of the violence of the act. Marc Antony, Caesar's most trusted lieutenant and the man designated to deliver the funeral oration, stood before this immense crowd. He was a master of rhetoric and theatricality. His speech, as recorded by the historian Plutarch, began not with fire and fury, but with calm, measured words, a facade of respect for the Senate and the conspirators. He began by praising the assassins as honorable men, a phrase he would repeat with increasing irony. He reminded the crowd of the Senate's decree, the very amnesty that had granted the conspirators their freedom. He was setting a trap, and the crowd, initially silent and respectful, was slowly being drawn into it. Antony's speech was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. He didn't directly accuse the conspirators of murder. Instead, he simply laid out the facts, but with an emotional weight that was impossible to ignore. He read from Caesar's will, a document that revealed the dictator's immense generosity. Caesar had bequeathed a significant sum of money to every Roman citizen and had left his extensive gardens on the other side of the Tiber River as a public park for all to enjoy. This was a revelation that hit the Roman populace hard. They had thought of Caesar as a benevolent dictator, but this confirmed it. He was a man who had loved them, a man who had cared for their welfare. The conspirators, who had claimed to kill him for the good of the Republic, had killed a benefactor of the people. As Antony's words sank in, he began to turn the screw. He spoke of Caesar's military triumphs and his service to Rome. He recalled how Caesar had wept when he saw the statue of Alexander the Great at a young age, mourning that he had accomplished nothing. Antony then began to read a list of the honors the Senate had bestowed upon Caesar, the very honors that had been used as evidence of his tyrannical ambitions. He held up a blood-stained toga, said to be the very one Caesar wore on the Ides of March, and pointed out each of the stab wounds, connecting them to the names of the conspirators. The crowd, which had been slowly shifting from confusion to sorrow, now began to murmur with anger. The climax of the speech was pure theater. Antony, overcome with feigned emotion, descended from the speaker's platform and knelt beside Caesar's body. He lifted the wax effigy for all to see, a silent, gruesome testament to the brutality of the act. He then spoke of the ultimate irony. The man who had conquered the world had been killed in the heart of Rome by his supposed friends. The dam of emotion broke. The crowd, no longer a collection of individuals, became a single, enraged mob. They roared for vengeance. The conspirators, watching from the Capitoline Hill, must have felt a cold dread as they heard the change in the crowd's tone. The amnesty, which had seemed like a victory, was now worthless. The mob, now a force of nature, seized the wooden benches and tables from the forum and built a spontaneous funeral pyre. They cremated Caesar's body right there in the center of the forum, a place hallowed by centuries of Roman history. The fires burned for hours. Afterward, the mob, fueled by rage, roamed the city, hunting for the conspirators. Their villas were attacked, and they were forced to flee for their lives. Antony's oration had done more than just honor Caesar. It had unleashed a popular fury that made a civil war all but inevitable. The conspirators' tragic act, intended to save the Republic, had, in a single devastating speech, sealed its fate. The aftermath of Marc Antony's fiery oration was a power vacuum, a tumultuous space where old political certainties had evaporated and new alliances were forming in the swirling chaos. The conspirators, now declared enemies of the state by popular will, had fled Rome. The city was a powder keg, and Antony, with Caesar's will and papers in hand, was in a prime position to seize control. He was a popular figure with the legions and had the immediate loyalty of many of Caesar's veterans. He began to consolidate his power, positioning himself as the rightful heir to Caesar's legacy. However, a new and unexpected player was about to enter the stage, a young man who would prove to be Antony's most formidable rival. This new figure was Gaius Octavius, a mere 18-year-old and the grandnephew of Julius Caesar. In Caesar's will, which Antony had so effectively used to stir the people, Octavius was not only adopted as Caesar's son, but also named as his primary heir. This was a political earthquake. With this act, Octavius became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, or Octavian, as he is known to history. He was now, in a legal and symbolic sense, the son of the deified Caesar. He arrived in Rome from Apollonia and immediately began to assert his claim. He demanded control of Caesar's inheritance and sought to fulfill his promises to the Roman people, a move that put him in direct conflict with Antony. Initially, Antony underestimated Octavian, seeing him as a naive, inexperienced boy. He refused to hand over Caesar's inheritance, believing he could easily outmaneuver this upstart. But Octavian proved to be a political genius far beyond his years. He used the immense wealth left to him and the name of Caesar to win the loyalty of Caesar's veterans and the Roman populace. He presented himself not as a power-hungry politician, but as a dutiful son seeking vengeance for his father's murder and a way to uphold his legacy. The Senate, in a stunning display of short-sightedness, initially supported Octavian, seeing him as a useful tool to counterbalance Antony's growing influence. They believed they could use the young man to restore the Republic, but they were tragically mistaken. The political situation spiraled into open conflict. Antony and Octavian, both vying for control of the Caesarian faction, found themselves at war with each other. This period, known as the Mutina War, was a chaotic and bloody struggle. Antony was defeated at the Battle of Mutina by the forces of the Senate, which were led, ironically, by Octavian. However, the Senate's plan backfired spectacularly. After his victory, Octavian marched on Rome, not to restore the Republic, but to demand the consulship for himself. He was now a military power in his own right, and the Senate was forced to concede to his demands. The true end of the Republic came not with Caesar's death, but with the formation of the Second Triumvirate. Realizing they could not defeat each other, Octavian and Antony, along with another powerful Caesarian supporter, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, met to forge an alliance. They formally created the Triumvirate, a three-man dictatorship for the restoration of the Republic. This was a cynical and brutal act. Their first move was not to restore liberty, but to hunt down their enemies, most notably the conspirators who had murdered Caesar. They instituted a series of bloody proscriptions, a list of senators and knights to be executed, their property confiscated. The assassins of Caesar, including Brutus and Cassius, were relentlessly hunted. The Triumvirate's forces ultimately met the forces of Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE. It was a decisive and final clash. The Caesarian forces were victorious, and both Brutus and Cassius took their own lives rather than be captured. With their deaths, the last vestiges of the Republic's old guard were extinguished. The betrayal of Caesar, an act intended to save the Republic, had instead unleashed a chain of events that led to its definitive end and the rise of a new, even more powerful ruler. The betrayal of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March, 44 BCE, was a moment that reverberated through history. A single, bloody act that had consequences far beyond the deaths of a single man and the conspirators who were eventually hunted down. What began as a desperate attempt to restore the ancient Roman Republic paradoxically led to its definitive demise and the birth of the Roman Empire. The legacy of this event is not simply in the political changes it wrought, but in the timeless themes it explored: friendship, duty, ambition, and the tragic clash of ideologies. For the Roman Republic, Caesar's death was the final nail in the coffin. The civil war that followed, first between Antony and Octavian, and then between Octavian and Antony, was the bloody, messy end of a political system that had been in decline for decades. When Octavian finally emerged as the sole ruler of the Roman world, he understood a crucial lesson from his adoptive father's death. The Roman people would not tolerate a king, but they would accept an emperor. Octavian, now known as Augustus, carefully avoided the titles of dictator or king. Instead, he presented himself as the princeps, or first citizen, a humble title that belied his absolute power. He maintained the facade of the Republic, keeping the Senate in place and holding elections, but all real power rested with him. The betrayal of Caesar, intended to prevent the rise of a single ruler, had simply paved the way for a more cunning and permanent form of autocracy. Augustus learned from Caesar's mistakes, and in doing so, he cemented his own power and founded a dynasty that would last for centuries. The legacy of the assassination also deeply impacted the conspirators themselves. For Marcus Junius Brutus, the betrayal was not an act of political expediency, but a profound moral choice. His famous, tragic conviction that he was acting for the greater good of Rome became his enduring historical image. He is not remembered as a murderer, but as the last champion of a dying republic. His final words, as he fell upon his sword after the Battle of Philippi, lamented his failed attempt, but not his cause. The philosophical and political debate about his actions, was he a hero or a villain, has continued for 2 millennia, immortalized in the works of writers from Shakespeare to modern historians. Brutus became a symbol of the idealist who is willing to sacrifice a friend for a principle, a figure of both admiration and tragedy. The story of the betrayal also had a profound cultural and literary impact. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition and the fragility of political systems. The assassination and its aftermath became a popular subject for playwrights and poets. Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, written more than 1,600 years after the events, remains the most famous dramatization of the betrayal. His iconic lines, such as "Et tu, Brute?" and Marc Antony's powerful funeral oration, shaped how generations of people have understood the events. Shakespeare's play transformed the historical figures into archetypes. Caesar, the ambitious but beloved ruler; Brutus, the honorable but naive idealist; and Antony, the cunning orator who could turn a crowd into a mob. The play cemented the moral and psychological dimensions of the story in the Western imagination. In a final, poignant reflection, we can see the betrayal of Caesar as a pivot point in history. It was a moment when the ideals of the Republic, a system of law and shared governance, finally and irreversibly gave way to the reality of empire, a system of centralized power. The dagger blows on the Ides of March were not just aimed at a man, but at an entire way of life. The conspirators, in their haste and short-sightedness, failed to realize that the Republic was not a building that could be saved by removing a single stone. It was a structure built on a foundation of customs and traditions that had been eroding for decades. Caesar was not the cause of the Republic's decay, he was a symptom of it. The betrayal, meant to be a cure, was ultimately the final act of a long, slow death. It is a story that reminds us that even with the best of intentions, human actions can have unintended and catastrophic consequences, forever changing the course of history.